Hello guys, welcome back to Nozasmeca. It's Marco here, and today we continue our journey into mood and bold cinematic lights. I'm the kind of painter that gets into deep rabbit holes in a constant recurring cycle, and the obsession of this season is strong environmental light. I'm also the kind of painter that learns mostly by doing, so you have to watch me painting at least a couple of good models on the theme before I let go of this bone.
In the last video, my objective was to deliver an illustrational feel, binding my lights in a two-dimensional pattern, built around the core of the sculpt and its two main XY axes, forcing a perpendicular view and a frontal fruition of the model, like the one you get from a painted picture. The secondary angles still get interesting stuff to look at, with the natural spread of the main lights into the third dimension. But everything is just a simple mechanical consequence of the strong main shot, and with, at least in my mind, diminishing returns on the other angles. There's nothing wrong with it, and the bust with its floating presence, especially with this kind of static composition, really benefits from a solid frame on the frontal view. But this week, I want to tackle the topic of cinematic lights from a totally different perspective. The idea in this case is to create a model that you cannot stop moving around. A dynamic full figure naturally has a built-in 360 degrees flow, and still locking it into the more manageable four main planes of a square plinth, I want to maximize this flow with waves of light. This is the rough technical goal of the exercise, but as always, the process started from pure storytelling. This guy has a strong Witcher vibe, and I immediately imagined him on a hunt. In a cold winter night, the veteran monster hunter enters a cave lighting his path with a magical flame, and soon finds out that his suspicions were well founded. Something sinister is happening here. Warm and cold, light and dark are at the same time technical light setting and part of the narrative, and their natural, uninterrupted flow makes you spin the model over and over to read the story. In the description you can find all the links and details of this beautiful model and this super talented sculpture that brought it to life. To make the work easier and more believable, I use reference material to guide the translation of the idea into paints and pigments. And here is a little selection of the pictures I kept on the table while painting. Mostly comic book covers, for a clean, stylized look. Nothing is extremely specific to my needs, but every picture contains a little fragment of my final product. I just need to put the pieces together.
Don't forget to drop a like to help the diffusion of this video and the channel, and of course subscribe to join my painting journey in every corner of the hobby. And if you want to support my work, check my Patreon page, where you can find articles, extra material, and the real-time footage of my videos, with every single little line and brushstroke. Thanks a million, guys!
It's been a while since my last 3D printed model on the channel. And as always happens in manga and anime's time jumps, I got a power-up. I plan to print and paint professional, high-quality display models with increasing frequency, and the 6K resolution of this machine really helps in closing the gap with the quality of commercial figures. The huge printing plate and the mono screen drastically cut the working time, and I can get a full battery of display figures in a couple of hours. And talking about improvements in my process, here is also my new washing and curing station. No more messy pickle jars and claustrophobic nail polish dryers. This size can seem an overkill for miniatures, but as a professional I must be ready for any request and situation. And recently I had some real issues with my equipment, working on action figures and their big accessories. So it's great to have access to a huge potential post-processing volume that matches my potential printing volumes. Working on complex lights, I always start a sketch painting the main light source of the scene. The flame is the origin of all the imaginary photons hitting the upper part of the body, so I can safely paint it in solid opaque white and build my progression from there. This is one of the key aspects that we must keep in mind to create the illusion of light. The source must be the lightest, brightest, and most luminous spot. We don't need to go super in depth into the quantum mechanics of the particle, wave, phenomenon nature of light. But because I'm a nerd, I find it easier to handle and render if I think about it in terms of energy and vectors. The flame is actively spreading energy around starting from its core, and if you consider it like a full battery at 100% of its charge, immediately around the origin, you are at 99%, and so on until the energy is completely spent and dissipated. The actual proportions of this loss of intensity, or if you prefer, the magnitude of the physical vectors, are totally up to you, depending on what kind of light and luminosity you have in mind. But still, the source must be the highest point. With this dispersive behavior clear in mind, another important aspect to consider is the direction of these vectors. Light moves from its source like an explosion. So when painting, I always picture in my mind a sphere around the origin, and I hit with paint everything inside that bubble. If something blocks this diffusion, like in this case the hand holding the flame, its projection inside the bubble simply doesn't get any paint. And again, this is true not only for OSL effects, with an explicit sculpted source on the model itself, but for any kind of light, even for the simplest and most diffused zenithal light for gaming models. Instead of a close flame, light bulb or spell, the source is maybe a distant sun outside the scene, but the light hitting the top of the head has still to be more powerful than the one reaching feet and ground. In the back, I set a simple general light coming from above, with, for the sake of composition, just a bit of an angle on the diagonal that connects the two corners of the plinth. But, even if it's coming from a faraway moon, probably filtered by a clouded sky, I still keep in mind and use that idea of dispersion inside the sphere. A really big bubble, for sure, but with the same internal rules. The distinction that we make between OSL and environmental light is a bit silly and misleading, because light is light. It doesn't really matter if you see or not see the source. If you start thinking any light and light setting as an OSL, your models will automatically get a ton of interesting and realistic contrast. Never ever think that I get all this stuff right at the first try. Painting is always a back and forth, fluid process. I'm pretty happy with the work on the flame and its surroundings, but I've been a bit too trigger happy with the light from below. So I adjust the sketch with black ink and the new grayscale coming from its overlap with white. And I go back again to white to soften the transitions, and adjust even better all the shapes. Here I need to point out an important feature of my value sketches. All the values in the sketch are a tiny bit higher than the values I want to see on the final model. The reason is simple, and entirely based on the subtractive behavior of paint and pigments, even on values. Physically layering tones on top of the sketch, I lose part of its original luminosity, so I tend to compensate from the very beginning. This is quite important working on the shadows, because I want them to be dark, but not black, in low values, but full of tones, so I need a bit of grayscale to make them visible. Time to apply the local colors of the materials. I want the various lights to naturally interact with the intrinsic colors of skin and equipment, so I fix their presence with light, quick and loose passes of the airbrush. If a color is too opaque straight from the bottle for what I need here, I simply cut it with thinner and few drops of medium or varnish, just to control the finish and fight the extra glossy contribute coming from the dry airbrush thinner. Here I'm using varnish just because I ran out of fluid medium that usually covers the same function. I really don't know the proportions I'm using. The mix is totally eyeballed, but I know precisely what's the kind of transparency I want to get. And I fix another uniform, transparent layer over the sketch. For smaller elements, difficult to precisely frame with the airbrush, I switch to GW Contrast, heavily diluted with medium and water, to create the same soft transparency. You can recreate all the steps with any kind of paint and tool. I use inks and contrast because I have them. And they are a bit closer to what I want and I like to use, straight from the bottle. But you can get the same behavior from any standard acrylic, simply playing with dilution. Same idea for leather and fur. And the ground. Again, the main objective is to maintain the information of the sketch as much as I can, filling the mid-values with the proper mid-tones, to have a general idea of the scheme of outfit and equipment, and their contribute to the final picture. Time for the fun part, where the boring foundational scheme meets the chromatic lights. I start from the yellow base tone of the flame, applying it with the same mindset and angles I've used sketching its value, because it's literally the same thing, and color is just another part of it, separated and applied in a different step for a simple technical convenience. The main advantage of this workflow is that I can layer the events in their natural, chronological, and physical order, with the local colors hit and altered by the external chromatic light in a realistic way. I spray a bit of yellow also on the lower parts of the base, to boost the saturation of the next layer of green in localized patches, and make it a bit more acid, warpstone-like. Again, the sketch that comes out in transparency is telling me what to do, where to add, and make the parts more or less green. Same idea in the back, but with a way more delicate application of turquoise, to filter everything under the cold tones of a snowy winter night. You can see that to keep it extremely soft, I use not only the same kind of translucency I've used for the base tone of the armor, but I also keep the airbrush way much farther away from the model, to have just a light, uniform mist of paint really hitting the surface. The light source here is more distant, weaker, and therefore less saturated, so this is everything I need on this side. With the 3 basic hues of my 3 light sources in place, I can start adding tones to the shadows. Orange is an obvious first step for a warm yellow progression. I don't add anything to the green, because it already has its own internal modulation. The elements that got the yellow underpainting tend to warmer and more vibrant notes by themselves, and the spread around the yellow core delivers more of the colder, bluish hues of the original color straight from the pot, so the modulation is already deep and rich. I close the shadows with a unifying pass of magenta. This tone is perfect to bring all the different parts together, because it's the consequential, natural step of the warm yellow progression, creating by itself a bit of red from the overlap and the optical mix with yellow and orange, and then turning into its intrinsic colder sensations. I don't have to worry about values, because these transparent applications get the information from the sketch and all the previous layers. And it's also great in the back, creating a nice contrast of temperatures with the cold main light, suggesting the living warmth of this body in the cold environment, and of course creating continuity with the frontal elements. But again, painting is a fluid process, and before putting away the airbrush, I enhance my lights, reintroducing a bit of the luminosity I've lost in the terminal parts, using again white ink. Don't be afraid to take a step back. Videos and tutorials give the idea that the process is a perfect linear path. But even if it's true that if you make something, must be to push forward the general work, it doesn't mean that this is obtained without taking a step back. I don't know if this makes sense. On top of this new light, I bring back saturation and hues with the soft pass of the basic yellow and green from the initial stages. And here is my starting point for the brushwork. Guess what I've got? The first expansion of Chimera Colors with 14 new tones. And a perfect timing to paint powerful lights and reflections. The map of the brushwork is already completely set, so my needs are simple, and my palette is going to reflect this simplicity until the end. Powerful yellow tones in the full spectrum of temperatures, and the super luminous titanium white. Few brown tones, mostly because I'm curious to see how they look like. And the simple progression from blue to green for the back, and this new dark ochre. That's a great mid-tone for the skin I've set at the beginning with raw sienna. One of the few Citadel pots I own for a kick to the acid green. And I want to see cobalt blue-green next to the turquoise from the Cartacci set. Oh, and I forgot a bit of purple for my shadows. In this phase, I have two main objectives. Create definition and break the perfect uniformity and smoothness of the airbrush finish, adding to the mix a ton of painted and real textures and movement. If you start using the airbrush in more advanced and diffused ways, one of the first tricks you have to learn is how to bridge the extremely different finishes of sprayed and brushed layers. You can get away with a ton of crimes working on standard miniatures and their micro volumes, but this display scale is quite unforgiving for this kind of visual discrepancies, and that's why it's a great instructive challenge for painters of any level. In this case, my work is inspired by comic book covers and their relatively stylized look. So I'm looking for a clean result that needs a subtle approach to this problem. One of my favorite tricks is to use again the crazy transparency in which you can stretch acrylic paint to create that discrete change of finish with a more solid painterly vibe. I almost completely abandon water as a thinning agent, using almost 90% medium to create super translucent pools of paint. In terms of transparency and dilution of the pigments, we are totally in the realm of glazes. But for this approach, I don't want the free-flowing consistency of water, because I will not use long free-flowing brushstrokes. The medium keeps the consistency of the paint almost the same of the one I have straight out from the bottle, because most of that density comes from the medium anyway. And with that consistency, I can apply super fine dots that stay perfectly in place, but with all the properties of a glaze. This way I get more precise and localized small modulations in the high and extreme lights and shadows, creating the sharper definition of a final piece. And at the same time, every single squared millimeter gets a ton of interesting subtle movement. That can be a super tight dotted pattern on the skin, dense clusters of little wrinkles on the leather, and small scratches and battle damages on the equipment. I want some of that brush movement, even on something smooth, like the glass of the potions on his belt. So to paint the white reflections of moonlight and snow, I keep using the dotting glaze. I get an incredible control, both on the progressive opacity and the precise, difficult shapes. Later, I'll block the effect under a thick coat of gloss varnish to boost the idea and the look of a totally different material. One of the most interesting things that I picked up from this paint job, and that now is in my mental library of effects, comes from the work on the right hand, and studying pictures of fire eaters and jugglers. The fingers are for sure in the middle of the light explosion, but in our perspective as external viewers, they are a solid screen for that light. To give the idea of the strong contrast that this situation should produce, from our point of view, I made the fingers way darker than my original rendering, thinking them like a silhouette against the powerful light. As always, the timing of the real-life process is completely different from the one synthesized in the video. The whole airbrushing session took me only a few hours, while all the brushwork took 2 extra days of work. But the huge difference is in my active mental involvement. The first part is the one that carries all the theoretical and technical weight, and most of the general information of the final result, and it's the one with the deepest pitfalls. Sure, the stakes can be considered low because it's just the beginning of the work, but if I miss something, I start building on weak foundations, and I always pay a heavy price later. So I'm super careful and aware of every little interaction. Here, my conscious brain is almost completely shut off, and I float in the joys of the flow, letting the hand do its thing. A day is gone, and it seems like half an hour. And here is the final result. A super fun project that I had the need to paint to properly set in my hands and brain my newfound understanding of cinematic lights and storytelling in miniatures. Of course, this is an extreme, super exaggerated situation, created to be purposely over the top and to challenge my ability to render such a scene. We don't need 3 main powerful lights to make a rich and interesting model, but I like to know that I can pull it off when or if needed. Again, in this phase of the channel's life, I feel the need to play with more experimental stuff, to keep pushing the limit of what I can do with paint and minis, and I'm extremely grateful to everyone arrived to this point of the narrative, because it means that you are looking for the same kind of artistic challenge and thrill, and I love to be part of this shared wave of inspiration.
If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Remember that you can ask me anything down below with a comment, and you can follow my projects during the week using one of my socials. And if you want to support my work, check my Patreon page and join the community, or maybe ask for a commission. See you next week, guys!